Good afternoon once again. So glad that you're in here with me. Right across the way, of course, we have the lounge where there's an assortment of DJs and talent performing. What's interesting is that this is the 50th year of hip hop, or at least that's what we call it, the 50th year of hip hop, right? And at this 50th year, we're so pleased to be able to host not only DJs over there, but they're like just all women DJs. And what's notable about that gender in particular is how absent or how marginalized women were in hip hop and have been in hip hop for so long. And so we often have to think about ways of correction, ways of bringing voices to the table and people to the table that hadn't historically been there. And I want to really just acknowledge the one of the most powerful contributions that Mr. Bivens made to this year's AEP is by insisting that more voices are at the table when it comes to measuring the economic impact of our arts and culture organizations. Unless you have that kind of leadership, you may have voices that are omitted. You may have voices that are excluded, whether on purpose or not. So you have to be intentional about who you have around the table. And so I just want to again acknowledge Mr. Bivens for that. So please give him a round of applause for that. So what I'm here to present is just really just a taste of what the St. Louis AEP 6 findings are. And just know that this is, again, merely a taste, all right? The document itself it's a nice thick size. Like if you were to print it out from a printer, it's a good number of pages, right? So that means that you can really dive in. And honestly, the tables that are in the document itself, in the report itself, gives you a wealth of information that I will not be providing for you in my presentation at this time. I'm just letting you know. So if you came here thinking that I was going to drop all this data on you, no. I'm only going to give you a little piece of the data, a little piece. You'll be able to see the rest of the data, if you so like, at the Regional Arts Commission website, which is racstl.org. You'll find all of that. Plus, a part of CULTURA Digital, you'll see these pieces of information. Now, as we do talk about some stuff, I want you to post your questions or your comments using the QR code that's available to you. You'll see that momentarily. So let us begin. So what is AEP, right? It is the Arts and Economic Prosperity. It's a study that's been conducted over the years in these iterations since about the 1990s. When it began in the 1990s, there were 33 communities that participated. And in this particular community, there were like 35 organizations that were sampled. And it's not to say that there weren't more organizations that were sampled. It's just that they were using this population of about 93. And of that population, they did a random selection of about 35 to kind of get the flavor of what the economic impact was. Now, the reason why they did that is because they wanted to enforce the idea that this is legitimate science. I don't know if you know this, but when it comes to the social sciences, not everybody agree that the social sciences are in fact science. I know it's an odd situation, but it's true. And so because there's not everybody who agrees with it being actual science or knowledge or fact-based, that means you always have to argue for why it's relevant. Now, I'm going to give you some data just so that you can kind of understand it, but just know that the context of this data presentation is really a war over knowledge. It really is. Who gets to say what's true? Who gets to say what's factual? How do we define truth? How do we define what's factual? That is an important thing to remember. Because as we go through this process, even though we are presenting data that we know is based on how we've captured data here, not everybody accepts it. And so we have to always fight the good fight of saying that this is legitimate, that this is valid. All right, so returning to this, just know that in St. Louis, we were able to capture data from over 200, well, actually over, but from 233 organizations. Now, some of the data that we captured came directly from them completing surveys. Some of the data came from us collecting publicly available data that they made available on their websites or was available through the IRS 501c3 990s that are available to the general public. So basically, we gather this data so that we can have a sense of what the economic outlook looked like for St. Louis. And then we collected data from 1,900 event attendees. So anybody who goes to an open mic, anybody who goes to a concert, people like you, right now in this space, you're an event attendee. So we captured that data as well. And that helped us get to this point where we can give this information to Americans for the Arts, where they employed an input-output analysis. That's some economic stuff, right? I'm not really an economist at all. Actually, I'm not an economist at all. We have an economist on our panel. I am a sociologist by trade, just to let you know. That's my area. And I don't say it lightly. I mean, I study this stuff. I teach this stuff. This is what I do. But in terms of economic modeling, if you wanted me to wax philosophic about it, I can't. But I will give you some pointers. I'll give you some things to think about. One, this is based on the multiplier principle. I'm sure you've heard about multipliers before, maybe on the morning news, maybe in the class you took, whatever the case may be. It's based on the multiplier principle. Put simply, a macroeconomic theory that asserts spending becomes income. So whatever somebody spends eventually becomes somebody's income. And it makes sense, right? That squares with your understanding, right? I mean, you go to a store, you spend $100, part of that $100 is going to the cashier, and then that part of that money is going to go to that person's wage, and then that person's wage then goes to their savings, and it goes to an event that they might go to, right? Well, let's start it from the arts organization. Somebody gives that arts organization money. Maybe it's a grant. Maybe it's a big time donation, whatever the amount is. And then that money then is used to pay the artistic talent that's involved. If we're talking about maybe a theatrical event, maybe it was building the stage. Maybe it was painting the walls, or painting the walls of an art gallery. Bottom line to it, these are real dollars that are going into people's pockets. And then after they go into those people's pockets, they go out in the community. They spend it at gas stations. They spend it at child care. They spend it over and over again. So we're looking at how money is respent in the community. So this is a cycle. This is a cycle, and that's essentially how the multiplier works. That the money just doesn't stop. It could, theoretically. Like, how many of you are good at saving? By show of hands, how many of you are good at savings? Like, you save all of your check? Oh, of course you don't save all of your check. Who does? We got utilities, we got bills we have to pay. So unless you're like somebody's dependent, which you could be, and it's no diss if you are. I mean, but unless you don't have to spend your money, you're probably spending your money somewhere, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. AEP 5 found, this is the last iteration of AEP, found that $590 million were generated from spending in the arts in St. Louis. And from that data collection, we learned that, 163 organizations gave us that knowledge, right? Gave us that information by completing surveys. 1,500 people gave us that knowledge by completing surveys. And from there, they figured out that it was worth about $590 million to our local region, right? To our metro area. To put another way, if the organizations did not have or did not spend that money, then that money may not be respent in the community. Now, this is an understatement because we're only talking about 163 organizations. There are so many arts and culture organizations in St. Louis. If you go to the IRS master file and you just looked up organizations in St. Louis that are arts and culture, you'll find about 700. Just go to the IRS master file. You'll find about 700 that are arts and culture. Now, not everybody is active. Many of them are grassroots. They're just there to do the work because it's meaningful. And they're not necessarily trying to build institutions. They're just trying to build ways forward for people and trying to create community through their work, but still 700. Now, that said, that means that many of the events that these organizations are doing is just simply undercounted. We don't know. Now, for the AEP 6 findings, the big number, like the headline number, is $868 million. That sounds like a lot. Matter of fact, it sounds so big, I imagine for some of you, that you're like, there's no way that could be a real number. That's not a real number. Well, it is. It is. Now, how they get there, you'll read the report and we can talk about it, maybe on Cultura Digital or what have you, right? But ultimately, we're talking about capturing data of all the expenditures of organizations that participated, 233 organizations to be exact, and about 1,970 some odd attendees. So those two numbers, those two spending categories have been added up, and this is how we get to this 868 million. Now, of course, that's more than before, and you're thinking, wow, well, how can it be more than before? We just came out of this work stoppage due to the pandemic. Simply put, more organizations we captured information from. Organizations like one that I founded. I didn't participate in AEP 5. I don't know if I participated in any of the AEP studies. As a lead for a small grassroots black organization, that just wasn't top of mind for me. And to be honest, I wasn't top of mind for the data collection. And the reason why is because you want to capture information from the most, from those organizations that are doing the most economically in the region, right? So those would be those top, 10 or so organizations with these humongous budgets. You want to capture that information for sure, because that gives you a sense of how much money is being moved around. So for grassroots organizations, you may not look to capture all of that data because you just simply don't know. All right, that said, we were able to participate and be a part of that $868 million number, right? We were able to share what our findings were for the region. And again, that's part of the reason why the number is so much bigger. Also, it's because there's a change in the economic model, but we'll get to that in just a second. Event attendees spent about $289.4 million. And now this is outside of ticketing. I mean, this is stuff that's from like buying food and drink, maybe staying at a hotel somewhere, whatever the case may be. All event-related money spent, but not necessarily the admission price. And this is something that AFTA has captured since day one, since the 1990s, excluding the admission fee. About 19 and a half, nearly 20% of attendees are non-local. So that means they traveled into St. Louis. Now, of course, we're in a bi-state region. We got a lot of counties around us, but they traveled into whatever event it was, and they spent their money. Matter of fact, they spent more money. Maybe that's gas. You see there with that $53.65 plus other factors. But ultimately, they spent more money. So that means that whatever is happening in St. Louis is good for the region economically. And we wouldn't have had those dollars locally had it not been for the event that was created to capture the imagination of the public. All right. So a little bit of context, right? So St. Louis creative economy, this is based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's always good to bring in other sources to kind of look at some things. So this number, this 89,000, this is based on a survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics did just to kind of see how much on average a person might be paid. And from that amount, now this is not everybody, of course, right? Not everybody's making about 89,000. This is an average, right? But if you look at how much money is coming out, the expenditures of that household, and again, it's not an individual, it can be a household, is $71,000. And part of that $71,000 goes towards food, housing, healthcare, transportation, entertainment, apparel, and services. Now, if you look at the entertainment and apparel and services, that percentage gives you a sense of how much of an impact, again, our arts organizations can potentially make, because those are the dollars I just mentioned earlier, just mentioned a few minutes ago, that go into an organization's budget, and then they spend it right back out, on props, if they're a theater company, on microphones, if they're an audio company, on artists, if they're on canvases or whatever the case may be. All that money is being circulated in our community based on that. And it's interesting, AEP 6 also captures data on that kind of number where we're estimating how much a person's income might be, and then imagining how much, well, not imagining, just based on the data, we're looking at how much those dollars might be spent in a variety of ways. Now, of course, looking at the data, we would be comparing apples to oranges. So one of the things that we have to consider, because, again, this has been going on for 30 years, and the first iteration of it happened in the 1990s, to say, okay, well, what's the growth been? Well, remember, we're just capturing kind of the economic stream of the moment. To kind of say that there is more this year versus the last year assumes that the variables are the same, and the variables are not the same. The methodology is not the same. So things have changed significantly to kind of prevent us from making those comparisons over the 5 years between the studies. Shifting eligibility. Again, if we were focusing mainly on the top organizations, the top tier in terms of the money that they're able to use to buy different things, to pay different artists, or whatever the case may be, if we're looking at only those organizations with healthy or robust multi-million-dollar budgets and not looking at anybody else, then that shifting eligibility means something. We're, again, bringing voices to the table that we hadn't quite considered before. And then second to last, expanding composition. Again, it speaks to adding more people and more voices. And of course, we are in a different world, a post-COVID world, and the arts aren't quite the same. But given all of that, this is what the numbers look like over time. The number of organizations that were sampled back in 1997, again, 35. And at the time, they did not capture event attendee data. Instead, they only captured organization data. Moving on to 2002, we see it moves up to 77 organizations. 2007, it moves up to 148 organizations. Then, whatever reason, slight dip to 137, and then we see in 2017, 163, to the point now where we have 233. These things are driven by intention. Right? These things are driven by intention. Every time we've done a study, we always wanted to capture all the voices necessary so we can get a realistic picture of what the economy looks like. And based on that, we learn more. We learn more about what the org expenditures were for each of those years. Same thing with the attendee expenditures were for each of those years. And it's not so much that this is what we can expect if we were to use like a bar graph or something like that. It doesn't quite work that way. This is capturing something in the moment. It's like taking a snapshot, a picture, really. So this isn't quite linear. This is just a moment. And what the moment looked like for the report that's released this year, it looked like that number, $868 million. Now, I think that's all that I have to say about that. I'm going to turn this over to our fantastic moderator. Thank you.
And now it is my pleasure to invite our panelists to the stage so they can give their takes on AP6 St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming Rachel D'Souza, founder of Gladiator Consulting, and economist and lecturer William Emmons. Yeah.
I don't mean to take too much of the show. So what we're going to hear from our panelists, I asked a couple of them to read the report in advance, and they have some feedback, some takeaways. And so they're going to offer their takeaways on the report, and then for like a few minutes apiece, and then we'll engage in a bit of a dialogue as well as take on your questions and comments. So beginning with Mr. William Emmons, what are your takeaways from the report?
Thanks, MK. I thought General Bivens did a fantastic job and looking at the national level, and MK fleshed it out nicely for the St. Louis level. So I would say, in my role as an economist, yes, this is a credible set of numbers. As MK said, you might not believe it, but it really is a large economic impact. And it's also very useful if you have an interest in this direction to see what are the connections between arts and culture and the broader economy. And so this report, and as he sketched out briefly, the methodology, the input-output analysis shows that there are direct, indirect, and what are called induced effects that can mount up to be very significant. And so arts and culture organizations are businesses, and they are part of the supply side of the economy, and those who consume these arts and culture activities are part of the demand side. So I mean, this is it's a good report, it's a credible methodology, and it's a big number. It's an important part of the economy. So things that it could do better, always there's room for improvement. I would say maybe more context. What do these numbers mean? Sometimes they look like big numbers, but you don't know how big are they. And just a couple of directions you might go would be to say compare the St. Louis numbers to some of the other metro areas. And as General Bivens mentioned, they range from very small to even larger than the St. Louis area. So it might be useful to compare us to whatever the largest community might be. Maybe, I don't know if Chicago was in there, but that would be an obvious one, that is a much larger metro area, but how do the arts and culture organizations impact that economy? Or look at a peer like a Kansas City or an Indianapolis or a Cincinnati, somebody like that. And then maybe a smaller market, Columbia, Missouri, or Springfield, Missouri, somebody like that. And then you might be able to really identify some strengths or weaknesses in our local arts ecosystem, some weaknesses, some opportunities, maybe some threats. As General Bivens talked about, people travel for arts and culture. So if there's a nearby competitor that's doing something better than we are, that is a threat potentially. Another thing that, I understand this is difficult and I think it will evolve over time, but my second maybe thing that the report could do better is talk about COVID. How did COVID impact arts and culture economic contributions? And there are obviously very short-term effects during the acute phase, and now as we come out of COVID. And I think we're going to need economic analysis and lots of other kinds of tools to help us understand what is really happening. And so, for example, the CARES Act of 2020, which was passed early on in the crisis, provided very significant funding for example, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, $50 million. National Endowment for the Arts, $75 million. National Endowment for the Humanities, $75 million. And the General mentioned their overall budget's about $200 million. So these are very large numbers. There were appropriations for arts and cultural institutions. The John F. Kennedy Center got $25 million. The Smithsonian Institution, $7.5 million. And on and on. And other programs, Paycheck Protection Program provided some funding. So, as part of the stewardship dimension of arts and culture, how well was that money used? For what was it used? So that maybe goes beyond the scope of this report, but I think this is maybe a first step, or this kind of report can provide some input into taking that next step and talking about how do we go forward. For example, that CARES money was one time. That's not a recurring source of revenue. At the same time, audience dynamics are changing. They were changing as the population ages, but then COVID, of course, affected people's willingness to engage in face-to-face things like theater or other cultural activities. So overall, I think it was a great report, continues on a tradition of really making or helping us think about the arts and cultures in a different way, seeing it as an integral part of our local economy. And so I commend the authors.
Great. Thank you so much. Rachel, how about you?
Awesome. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I think, first of all, I came at this report reading it as a consumer. So as a parent that has children at, summer camp here at COCA, or who does have season tickets at the Fox, or who does like to go to the Rep, definitely a person that I think MK said not saving money because I'm getting cookies after camp or I'm going to brunch before the show. So definitely happy to be a person, contributing to that nearly $900 million figure that he cited. One thing that really stood out to me in this report was the discussion that they had about the fact that in the previous 5 editions, really had not made a concerted effort to be more connected with BIPOC communities, or, as they're also referred to, members of the global majority. And we're very clear to say that a lot of our arts and culture organizations happen to sort of be Eurocentric dominant. And I found it really interesting. There's a particular quote: "When we prioritize diverse cultural expressions and traditions, it nurtures social connections, promotes community pride and identity, and boosts tourism by providing the authentic experiences that draw visitors to the community. If visitors have a positive experience, it may become a place to work and ultimately one in which to live. Creating viable communities is economic development." I think that sounds awesome, and I'm not totally convinced that our current arts and culture organizations are meeting the needs of the people who are living and working in this community. I'm all for bringing people here, but it is also very clear that we do have a St. Louis that is quite generous with our resources. We have really well-funded institutions, and we aren't centering the people that are a part of this community. We look at, honestly, what's happening at the Repertory Theater right now. They made the attempt to bring in some more diverse and representative programming. They made the choice to include people that were more representative of folks who wanted to go see those shows. And then I get an email last week telling me that because they don't have enough funding, they're going to have to cut a significant amount of their programming, which was targeted towards members of the global majority, which showcased characters with LGBTQIA or other identities that aren't typically always seen or showcased or appreciated in this sector. So I really wish that this report would have talked a little bit more about the ways in which the history of our community, the policies, the way that philanthropy shows up, has really created a space that, yes, St. Louis has a rich scene, but we aren't always meeting the needs of the people who are living and working in this community.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm going to call MK back up, and we will take questions. So we'll turn our attention to the screen. I've been reviewing questions and comments and posting them so everybody can see. And remember, any questions that we don't get to will be answered online through CULTURA Digital. All right, everybody. So our first question is, how can we help those in St. Louis and those visiting to navigate the immense number of local art institutions?
So there are, we have our wonderful website with the Regional Arts Commission. Jason, could you give us the web address?
Yeah, it is stlouisarts.org.
stlouisarts.org. Also, there is a social media footprint where if you follow St. Louis Arts on Instagram, you'll be able to learn about what's happening with these different arts organizations. And I think as the Regional Arts Commission, we're going to do more work around putting as much of a directory out there as possible. Again, we've been able to identify a number of arts and culture organizations through our research, but some of them simply don't have the capacity to do the level of marketing and communication that others do. So we have to help them, and part of that help is by identifying them and then putting them out there as much as possible. And hopefully their activity will then bring you through their doors.
Thank you. This question is for Rachel. How do we express the value propositions of diverse stories on the stage to donors, foundations, and corporations?
Oh, friends. So, here's what I think is true, and here's where the work happens. We have a pretty unfortunate traditional cycle of, nonprofits feeling scarce about resources, feeling in competition with each other. And so we try to present ourselves in a way that is palatable to funders who are going to keep funding us. And so I think in some ways our arts organizations are forced to be a little bit safe because of the values and the rules of the funders that they're seeking out. I think the best thing that we can do as nonprofit organizations of any size as we're raising money is be honest about the work we're doing and who we're trying to reach. Be clear about why we're trying to tell the stories or showcase the art we're trying to tell, and give people a space to learn. I would love change to happen overnight. I would love for organizations to fund differently, and for better or for worse, philanthropy and even government funding moves slowly. And so we have to sort of stay the course. We have to be willing to not cancel folks, because cancel culture doesn't lead to the change that we seek, right? So we have to be willing to move forward in that way. And I also think that we're stronger when we work together. So we need to get out of our silos as nonprofit organizations. We need to figure out how to collaborate in a way where we know that sharing isn't losing or loss, and that when one of our organizations is successful, it really means that everybody who appreciates the arts community in the region gets to experience something great. And I think when we have that shared vision, we'll start to see the funding shift.
Could I jump in and address this last question? How are you defining arts events in the study? For example, arena concerts, stadium concerts. So to you, MK, maybe, this report actually understates the role of arts if you have a broader definition of Taylor Swift as an artist. I mean, you can even broaden it and talk about sports. And so in a sense, you're maybe hiding your light by only looking at the nonprofit organization. Now, I think you can answer the question, I guess, but probably in terms of how do you approach legislators or funders, there's an important distinction between Taylor Swift and the rep.
That's right. That's right. And for all the Swifties out there, you know. What I'll say is that this particular report is about highlighting what nonprofit arts and culture organizations do. As you already know, I mean, when it comes to nonprofit work, if the thought is it that this is a worthwhile business, it's just viewed purely as a charity, so you're just giving your money away and not necessarily investing it in something that will have a benefit outside of the social good that it might, bring. But the economic benefit that this particular report on a national level and locally presents shows that nonprofits can be viable businesses that can contribute to the economic well-being, because we know what Taylor Swift is going to do. We know what Beyonce and the Beehive can do. We already know. But the key, though, is that we don't know what the rep can do. We don't know what the black rep can do. We don't always know what Coca can do. We oftentimes just see them as entities that get our money, but not necessarily give back in meaningful ways. And so what the report is supposed to do is provide us with some information so that we can advocate more effectively for nonprofit arts organizations. But for RAC, we are interested in the point that you just made, looking at the entire arts ecosystem, both for-profit and nonprofit. And I think in the years to come, we'll be able to fill that gap.
Thank you. Concerning audience spending, will you comment on the importance of cultivating younger and more diverse audiences for performing arts?
I get to be the younger audience. This is great, you guys. I think that we all have the opportunity to get out of our, traditional lanes and try something different. That might be the opportunity to include youth. I know that every year, the Sheldon and I think 9 PBS and a couple other organizations on Grand do a very family-friendly festival. And I think getting your kids oriented in this space, or cousins or neighbors or whatever, starts them on a journey where they can then make decisions for themselves and their own spending as they get older. I know that my children every year, because of one camp here at Coca, now spend a lot of their summer here, which is great for them and a little, challenging to my pocketbook, but it's wonderful because they're happy and they're getting an experience that they're not going to get in the classroom and they're not going to get at home, and so that's wonderful. I think the other thing I think of when I think about some of our arts institutions that offer programming is, what time are we having these shows at? What kinds of food and beverage are available at these shows? what kind of primers are we offering, and what languages are we offering these things in? And how often are those things happening? I think, we've finally gotten to a point where I've started to see more ASL, sign language interpreters in spaces. But what else are we doing to create inclusive spaces for people who deserve to benefit and enjoy the arts we have to offer in the community?
I'll observe our own children. My wife and I have 3 grown children, and the cliche is younger generations consume much more or live more of their life online. And so I think that presumably will be a challenge. How does one deliver in the ways that younger people are used to consuming entertainment, enrichment, even education, and employment? And of course, maybe the opportunity is to get people out of their houses because they're working from home and doing so much else online.
Great, thank you. How do you suggest individual artists and very small organizations use this data to help foster a more vibrant arts community?
Yes. Well, we're going to have a series of conversations about that in the coming year. Actually, the plan is just to try to engage you as much as possible. I mean, if you look at the report, how can you break it down in a way that will enable you to, as an arts organization leader, maximize the benefit that your organizations are hoping to derive from programs? I mean, just a moment ago, we heard from Rachel where she said that, that paying for classes here cost, right? We know that things could cost, but that is a model within the nonprofit arts and culture community that isn't fully exploited. This notion of having revenue generation, right? Figuring out ways of being able to sell things to the public that they can benefit from, for sure, but then also helps them pad their bottom line to ensure that they're not wholly dependent upon a grant maker or whatever philanthropy, but instead can depend directly on the community for support. So anyways, I think thinking about how we can dissect this data, and hopefully we can even form a bit of a think tank, right? But like how we can dissect this data so we can better learn its lessons and use those lessons in application as arts administrators, as organization leaders throughout the region. Cool.
Okay, thank you. So through the lens of AEP6, can you comment on the importance of funders and civic tourism organizations to collaborate and highlight the arts as a driver for visitors? The specific example that was given in the question was how RAC and maybe Greater St. Louis works together, but I think kind of pulling back a little bit just with these major institutions, how important is collaboration and what needs to happen to highlight the arts and culture sector in St. Louis?
I'll speak to that. This model, this type of analysis is very well suited for specific examples of, say, changes in funding. So the way the model is set up, it has what are called contributions. That's just the way the system works, and then impacts. So an impact would be, a discrete increase or a discrete decrease in funding, and that model allows you to trace that through. And so then you could bring that kind of analysis to a legislator and say, a decrease in funding in this community will result in the loss of this many jobs, of this much income. So this model is very well suited for that.
Excellent, thank you. MK, how can RAC use individual stories to help this data come to life? Numbers are big, can be hard for people to wrap their heads around, including funders.
Yeah, I mean, the beautiful thing about it, and let me just tell you, just going to take a moment here and celebrate my colleague over here, Jason. Jason has been doing a lot of the messaging and communication through social media, has been using opportunities to kind of communicate and tell these stories along with Jay, who's also our communications senior manager at the Regional Arts Commission. So essentially, we take this information and we put a human face to it because these are humans who are communicating this truth. And as a matter of fact, what you'll see later on are some of these artists who are communicating their truth, right? They're speaking. So like from a sociological standpoint, one of the things that's most valuable about data is when you hear from the subject that you're researching, right? And so we're researching what artists and arts organizations are doing. And by giving them the microphone to speak their truth, we capture that. Now, once we capture that, that information is really representative of the numbers. We're using the numbers to help tell this story, but that's only part of it. We still have to define it, and that's going to be defined by the artists that we talk to, that we interview, that we put on camera, that we uplift in our social media post or wherever the case may be. So the way that we tell the story is by imagining how these numbers impact a real human being. Now, how many of you are storytellers by a show of hands? Just really quick, how many of you are storytellers? We know that the base of any story is on reality. We are talking about something that we probably made up, but we want it to be plausible. And part of that plausibility is by linking it to a human being, right? And so that means that if a human being isn't communicating that truth, then it becomes implausible. And so whatever your mission might be, whatever your organization might be, starting with the data, that just gives you the ammunition, so to speak, to be able to say that this is legitimate, that this is real, this is representative of a larger group of people. But after that, you have to give voice to it. The numbers don't speak for themselves. You have to be able to speak for them. You have to be able to interpret that. And the best way to interpret it is by talking to the people who live it on a day-to-day basis. They exist. They're out there. You're some of them right now. So tell your story and know that the data backs you up.
So I think we have time for one more. AI is certainly a hot topic. Given the two slides within the age of artificial intelligence, do you see AI as a benefit to the way we conduct research? What about the way humans create art?
I was just at an AI virtual conference this morning, so I would love to chime in. The two pieces for me that feel really relevant is that in this chapter, we still see AI as a technology that tends to be male dominant and white dominant. And so thinking about using it as a tool, but understanding what lens it provides to us, and how do we include more women and other identities in the creation and the iterations of AI feels right. My kids have started to play around with different apps in school and learning things, and while I think AI has the potential to be an incredible tool and is doing some really wonderful things now, I'm not sure that it's a substitute for putting a paintbrush in a child's hand or allowing them to get on a stage and perform in any way. And so I think of it in the same ways as a lot of other things that humans have created to help us. It may help us grow, it may help us change, it may help us try things in a different way, but it isn't a substitute for feeling it and being a part of it.
Yes, I agree. It's the latest in a long line of technologies that have challenged us in so many dimensions, including the arts. I mean, think about radio, television, the internet. They've all challenged our traditional ways of and computers and maybe on the producing art, digital photography, all those sorts of things. And yeah, it's to those of us just learning about it, it's kind of frightening, but something we will need to deal with.
Okay, well, Rachel, William, MK, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.